Hello and welcome to season 6, episode 3 of Future of XYZ. Today, we're going to be speaking about a topic that is super close to my heart and very important for the future of the world, which is the future of circularity. With us, we have Joe Iles. Joe is the design activation lead at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, based in the UK, but activating organizations and policymakers around the world on principles of the circular economy, circularity, and specifically circular design. So, Joe, thank you so much for speaking with Future of XYZ today.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, that I'm a huge Ellen MacArthur Foundation junkie fan, I guess you'd say. I love the work that you guys are doing. You've been with the foundation since 2011. You studied history, but you really started with this kind of, channel insights news conglomeration around, the circular economy. And you founded that a long time ago, called Circulate, which you then worked on with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. I'm curious, given all of your expertise and experience in what many of our listeners and viewers aren't going to even know what circularity means. I'd love you to take a moment to define it in the context of this experience.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Well, circularity, and when we talk more about the circular economy, and maybe we can sort of get into why that is. And to us at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the circular economy is a system in which materials never become waste. So it sort of takes nature as inspiration in that sense. And so there's no such thing as waste. Nature is regenerated. And we think that this is a model that tackles climate change, that other global challenges like other types of pollution and biodiversity loss, chronic waste, things like that, and has the aspiration to decouple economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. So that's what a circular economy means to us, and it really comes down to three main principles: eliminate waste and pollution. So identify, reveal, and eliminate the sources of waste and pollution rather than treating those things as sort of inevitable and trying to then treat them after they've happened. Second principle: circulate products and materials at their highest value for as long as possible. So if something's working okay, keep it working, keep it in use for as long as you can. And then thirdly, regenerate nature. Put back at least as much as you take out from natural systems. And if we use design, we can build an economy that works along those principles.
Thank you for going through those three principles. I mean, there's so many threads there then to pull at, which I love, of course. I'm just gonna start in. I've heard an interview with you where previously you said design is a force for change. Design has the power to reshape our economy. I
Hmm.
obviously work for a design organization. I'm a huge proponent of both sustainability and sustainable principles, social impact, and design. I think design is kind of the foundation of everything that we create in this world, whether we're talking places and products or packaging and platforms or even, frankly, policies. Um, you've just talking about the circular economy. Like, where does circularity and economics actually connect?
Yeah, so I totally chime with you on the role of design in the design decisions that create the world around us. As far as the economics are concerned, well, the reason that we're pretty insistent about this term circular economy is that it really has to work economically. So our economy, we know, is dependent currently on huge volumes of resources and energy, and most of the stuff that we use we lose, and mostly just after a really short usage period, after which it ends up as waste. And when we sometimes forget that the economy exists to provide well-being, to provide opportunity, to provide security to people. Sometimes when we hear about the economy in the news, it's almost like this sort of mystical beast that sort of floats around living in the mountains or something. No, it's a thing that we sort of, the decisions that we make in business, in things we buy, in through policy, it's a thing that is sort of is created, a hugely complex thing, but it exists to deliver well-being to people. So for that economy to work long into the future and continue to provide the things that we need, prosperity to the people of Earth, it really needs to switch from linear to circular, because it really can't work when it's dependent on huge volumes of finite resources and energy. The other point, just with the economy bit, is I think it really drives home the systems angle. It's not really sufficient just to have a great product or one great material that you launch into the world and you say, I'm sure everything's going to be fine now. Props to the people who are doing that, this important work. But the whole economy has to shift. It's a systems play. The policy, behavior, product
Service
design,
design.
service design, it has to work together in concert.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, I'm a big systems thinker, and I often realize when you're doing change management in an organization, for instance, or in anything, you lift up the rock and you're like, oh, cool, we're just gonna do
Yeah.
that. And you lift up the rock and it's like all the critters scatter, and you're like,
Hmm.
ooh, like there were so many interdependencies, let's just put it. And when you're talking about the global supply chain, when you're talking about the global economy, it's not just, to your point, able to take one product and make the world different. You need to be able to have a supply chain and a materiality and a
Yeah,
labor force and a recyclability, upcyclability, reclaimability, et cetera, that really like work together.
for sure. And that's why I think, sort of understandably, we see a lot of people saying, well, you know what, because I lifted up the rock and it all was crazy complex, maybe I'll just try and do what I'm doing now, but just make it a bit more efficient. I'll just use a bit less resources and energy, but ultimately just do things in the same way. And that's fine, but that isn't the model for an economy that works in the long term. It just sort of stretches things out a bit further into the future, rather than treating the fundamentals of an economy that it doesn't work in the long term.
I want to get into some brass tacks, but I first want to ask you a question that I think is really material to this conversation, and also the work that you do, that Ellen MacArthur Foundation does, and frankly that our presenting sponsor IF Design does. What is the role of design, and specifically designers, in creating or adopting or embracing or amplifying circular principles?
Yeah, well, I think, again, it comes back to the fact that everything around us is designed. The decisions we make influence how we make and use things, and some of those things, it's when we think of a beautiful sports car, or a piece of designer clothing, it's very sort of, we have, often that's what comes to mind when people think of design, and the role, the agency of the designer in those things is pretty obvious, and often celebrated. But design decisions influence where we shop, the food we buy, how we travel, how we communicate, the all our sort of wants and needs as well. That sort of manufactured desire, sort of bridging over into sort of marketing. So um, those decisions that designers are making influence how we make and use things, and those decisions are, once they're made, are really hard to reverse. And I always like to think of the sort of scourge of microplastics, which is well documented, but it's almost impossible to imagine re- getting all the microplastics out of the environment, and sort of recovering them. It's entirely
Unfortunately.
possible. Yeah, unfortunately, right? I hate to be pessimistic, but it's entirely possible, and here's the optimism, to envisage a piece of clothing or a packaging system that never leaks plastic to the environment.
Yeah.
So really, it places the emphasis on those upstream design decisions, and to that point around eliminating waste and pollution at source, rather than trying to treat it downstream. And that's really where designers come in.
And you've alluded to like food systems. I know fashion is, I mean, that was my original background. That's how I got out of fashion and went into sustainability, in business. Fashion is a huge polluter in lots of different aspects, not just the end product. I think a lot of people don't really know that, like, obviously, like, I think it's a third of clothes that we produce, like, never even like get sold.
Mm.
But that's just the final end product. What industries are kind of the most ripe at this particular moment, and then looking kind of into the future for adopting? I know it's all industries, but what are like kind of the biggest industries that you're most bullish about for the future of adopting circular principles and having that kind of mass impact?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've named a few of them, right? So plastics. Um, I don't know. I think about 80% of packaging never gets recycled, right? And 50% of of packaging, plastic packaging is single use. Um, Fashion and textiles for sure, which you just mentioned. I think less than 1% of clothing is recycled. Most is landfilled or burnt, and huge amounts of structural waste, clothing that's never used, whether unsold or sit in the back of our closets, which I think, if we are honest, a lot of us can relate to. And then
No,
and then
definitely
you
not.
liar. And then food, yeah, food systems in which the way that we, there's waste problems again, throughout the from the farm to the fork, and beyond that, all along that chain there's different types of more or less and less visible waste. And then the way that we treat natural systems which we depend on for food is like a sort of mine. Like, we just constantly extract the value from those without thinking about the soil's ability to regenerate itself and continue to provide what we need. And that's where good work is going on in regenerative agriculture. Built environment is another one, right?
Cities and
City,
homes and
yeah, for sure. The energy use on one part, but also the huge energy intensity of things like concrete, the design of cities, and the where amenities are placed, and mass transport systems and so on. The role of green spaces in cities and the services that they provide, both in cooling, and ecosystem and habitat, and things like that. And in that area, folks like Ginny and Benyus and Biomimicry 3.8 are really
mm.
on it. And we released a report earlier this year called Building Prosperity, which covered some of that ground as well. So yeah, those are four: plastics, fashion, food, built environment. But then areas like finance are going to be absolutely critical. And I haven't even mentioned electronics, which is a huge waste stream. So you said it in the question, right? Every industry, it's just some are they are moving at different paces. For some, the solutions are a little more obvious, and for others, there's well, across the board, there's a lot of work to be done.
Thanks for the comprehensive kind of look at this. I mean, I feel like, as I mentioned at the outset, like I think a lot of people listening and watching may never even heard of circularity or
Yeah.
circular economy. I would argue, and I know it's a little different, this is the next level, but I first came to this topic through like cradle to cradle,
Mhm.
C2C, which is still a certification and an institution. Um, and I think it does a very good job. And I think some of your guys' work does a good job of explaining literally nonlinear finite resources, right?
Yeah.
Extractive versus regenerative. It's a from birth to death kind of, right? Like you're trying to maximize the life cycle. um how do these principles really, I mean, there's a lot of hype around sustainability right now, and also a lot of fear and a lot of doubt. I think most humans who have an ability to kind of think beyond like their immediate needs understand that this is, we're not doing good for the planet and we
Mhm.
need to do better. What is the opportunity for these circular, kind of cradle to cradle type principles to really impact climate change and to have a positive social impact? What's the opportunity?
Well, I mean, it's huge. Just taking climate change, we can't fix the climate unless we fix the economy. Again, a significant amount of waste, of emissions, pollution, come from the way that we make and use things. And our a study that we produced a few years ago called "Completing the Picture" estimated that around 55% of the emissions reductions that we need to see comes from renewables and energy efficiency. Super important, 55%, big part of the solution space. But the good news is, in some markets, renewable energy is reaching sort of price parity or is cheaper than fossil fuels. And there's a huge amount of investment in that space and a lot of coverage over renewables and efficiency measures, which is great. But what about that missing piece, the 45%? Well, that comes from the 45% of remaining emissions that are harder to address, come from how we make and use products, how we grow food, and how we manage land. And that's the space where, or those spaces are not where renewable energy and efficiency needs to show up. That's where the principle of a circular economy need to show up, how we make and use things. So that and that's where business models like rental, sharing, reuse, repair, remanufacturing, regenerative agriculture for food, growing food and managing land. That's where those come into play. So a huge relevance of the circular economy in climate change, in addressing climate change. On the social side, well, I can definitely say that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been really focused on materials as an entry point to talking about the circular economy and the way that our economy works, because it's a really urgent problem. It's massively overlooked, and it's gargantuan and complex. But and many other amazing organizations have picked up this point and are running with it. In many of our reports of the past few years, we've also highlighted the social impact as well. And perhaps the best way to sum it up, sort of without going into loads of detail, given the time we have, that I think it's fair to say the people that suffer or are disadvantaged by the negative consequences of today's linear economy are those that are least able to protect themselves from it, or sort of opt out of that.
Yeah.
They can't easily move to a cooler climate. They can't easily buy food that's grown in a regenerative way. They can't necessarily buy a 500 pound piece of furniture that you can repair or treat with a nice varnish to keep it going and
Yeah.
hand it down to generations that follow you. So that's why we need a circular economy that can deliver sort of opportunity and well-being, and make better solutions available to everyone. So there's
It's an
absolutely,
access question is what you're describing.
yeah, an access question. It's, again, this comes back to, this isn't just like a sort of niche, like a niche sort of bougie sort of option for people that can afford it. This is it's an economic shift, so it has to be accessible and available to everyone that participates in the economy,
Which is everyone. I mean,
which is everyone.
and ideally, that's the social impact, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, our 8.5 billion people, everyone gets to participate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because then what's the alternative? An economy of sort of exclusion and disadvantage, which none of us aspire to.
No, I think there are unfortunately some people who do aspire to that, which is, I guess, leads me to my next question, which is like, are there some, either best in class examples of circular programs that you've seen and the results of those, and really how widely adopted, or yeah, how widely adopted are kind of circular principles today, and what needs to happen to kind of grow this? I know
Yeah.
that's like 4 questions in one, but you can tackle it however you want.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm going to pick something that the foundation has worked on, a project out of our fashion work, and it's sort of my favorite thing that we've done, really. It's called the jeans redesign, and in that project, we brought together initially about 50 companies from across the denim supply chain.
50 companies.
Yeah, initially 50, and it quite quickly went up to over 100. But it was dyeing companies, yeah, denim mills, brands, retailers, waste management, folks like that. And we, over 2 days, they drafted up the basic guidelines for circular jeans. If you were going to design jeans for a circular economy, how would you do that? And so it was about durability, about chemicals, about the rivets and the metalwork, how that needs to be able to be removed, how many washes can they last, and so on. And then they took those, all the brands took those away and used them to design jeans that were fit for a circular economy. And now I think over 1.5 million pairs of jeans have been sold according to those guidelines. And it's sort of not even really about the initial, like, people going out and buying those jeans. For me, what's super interesting is that is, well, a few things. One, that's a model where we're saying, let's try and let's put into the economy products and materials that we want to circulate in the future, because hopefully all those jeans are going to be still knocking around for a good few years yet. But when it comes to trying to keep them in the loop, either in their current form or as the materials, they're designed from the outset to fit in a loop that works economically, and that where it's sort of viable for companies to engage in that. The other thing that I think is, if we're thinking about models for collaboration, the type of collaboration that we need for a circular economy, that's interesting about this is that in that group you had, I believe, Tommy Hilfiger and Primark. So a sort of more
Mass.
yeah, a mass, and then a sort of higher end, higher price point product. So both producing to the same sort of protocols.
Yep.
And to me, that represents this form of competition and cooperation that is really interesting, and is sort of it's sort of the way the internet works, right? A basic set of protocols that lets everything work together, but above which you can have a flourishing of creativity and variance
Mhm.
that is good for people, broadly speaking. So, and I think that's sort of what we need to think of with our material world is a set of protocols, or standards that everyone can subscribe to, but then you can sort of flourish and experiment above that baseline, because it's all designed to work.
Thank you for giving the example. I have to just do a plug. It's an old book now, but Fugitive Denim is a book that was
Mm,
one of the first books that I ever read when I was getting into this in like 2006, 2005, where I was like, oh boy, like, and it traces one pair of jeans through its life cycle. And you see labor practices and agricultural practice on the cotton, and the cotton picking all the way to the sewing, to the rivets, to and you realize, like, the globalization that many are kind of bemoaning right now. But not only is every single thing connected, but again, also that impacts the carbon footprint, which is something else, I guess, that circular principles are trying to kind of address, which is like, how do you make things practical, local, interchangeable, recyclable, all the things on
mhm,
the R ladder that we're not going to talk about right now.
uh-huh. Yeah,
um
very cool.
but I wanted to just, I mean, I'm watching time, Joe, and this conversation I could geek out on for a long, long time, as many could. But I think one thing we haven't talked about that I think is really important, is the role of technology and technological innovation in supporting, hopefully, the transition to a circular economy. Kenny Arnold, who's on the Ellen MacArthur team in the US, is working with me on a sustainability consultant for IF Design, and submitted a piece to our trend report last year, which was about digital product passports and
Yeah.
DPPs. And that's just one example. I've talked to supply chain blockchain people, like, about ownership and all the rest of it. Those might just be two examples, but what is the role for technology and adoption of new technological innovations in helping this transition?
Yeah, well, you mentioned digital product passports, tracking and tracing, things like that, all super relevant here. I'll mention about AI, which I think is pretty underexplored in terms of the circular economy transition. I, I, I'm fascinated by the question: is nature designed? Because we often use nature as a bit of a, like I said at the start, a yardstick for our own economy, or
Mhm.
I do and my colleagues do. And so I find it a nice provocation to say, is nature designed? And well, not really, according to our concept of design, which is it's quite piecemeal. It's sort of making decisions at a certain time and then sort of moving on and shipping something further down the line. If you looked at a plant growing up a wall, it would be designing, but with a sort of infinite range of inputs, like ongoing inputs: sunlight, nutrition, wind, predators, the surface it's growing on, the soil condition, the roots, the pollinators, the time of year. It's taking in innumerable sources of data to make decisions about what it should do next. And we're not really capable of doing that. But I have been noodling on the idea of, could we use AI to do that? Where we could, because we're going to need to, if we're going to launch product solutions into the world that we know is increasingly complex, and hopefully is getting a bit more circular all the time. Although current outlook is, maybe not, but hopefully the circular solution that I release, tomorrow, the opportunity for that to become a bit more circular, a bit more regenerative in a week's time, or a year's time, may be different. So we're going to need a way of like handling feedback in a much more dynamic way. And I do wonder, maybe that's a question for the listeners, is could AI support with that?
I love the provocation. I also have to ask, like, are there incentives in play that are going to help the transition? And what are those incentives? And kind of whose responsibility is it in this demand to transition?
You mean incentives for customers or for?
I think just for moving in this direction of of circularity. I mean,
Yeah.
whether it's corporate, whether it's governmental, whether it's organizational, whether it's consumer.
Yeah, well, other than the sort of master incentive of moving to an economy that works in the long term, I think the incentives will vary depending on the person who's hopefully inspired to and motivated to move on the topic. I think it could be about developing a closer relationship with customers or unlocking a new sort of innovation paradigm. It could be about gaining a competitive advantage by cycling materials that you already bought and paid for, or renting a product multiple times so you don't have to keep making it, where you use new resources and energy. Um, for we've had students, learners become inspired by this as a sort of creative outlet, as an opportunity to stimulate their own sort of learning, their own research and endeavors, rather than some of the more sort of guilt-laden messaging that is traditionally associated with sustainability. For policymakers, it could be around a new types of skilled jobs in the circular economy, or delivering safer, healthier spaces for people to live and work in. So the incentives are abundant. It really depends on who you ask and the opportunity that they see in it.
And I think that's a really nice kind of envelope to hold, which is like the incentives are actually the benefits. It's carrot, not stick.
I think
Um,
that's right. I think that's right. I mean, you can talk stick, you can ban things, you can make buying new products more expensive than buying secondhand by things like reducing taxation on repaired or refurbished goods. That sort of incentive as well.
mhm.
So for sure that they're out there. But what really interests me is our brands, our designers, our politicians gonna start creating a vision of a desire for a better future, one that where the future is better than today, and is based on a different set of principles. So I think there's still so much room to be done of yeah, we do know the scale of the problem that we face. We hear about it every week, or we unfortunately many of us can sort of see it out the window. But let's ignite a bit more of a desire for a better future, rather than just reminding ourselves of the problem, which we know is really urgent.
Well, that's a perfect tee up to the final question I always ask guests, Joe, which is the question of, um, you know, zoom out, next 10 to 20-ish years, imagine 2040, 2050. There's some big targets in the sustainable world around, in climate change and such, but just from your own personal kind of hope and wish and passion and prayer, like what's your greatest hope for circularity and by then?
Yeah. Um, hey, I'm going to mention about a traffic cone. So I was walking down my street a couple of years ago, and I saw a traffic cone. There was no like workmen around. It was this beat up, like dirty traffic cone that someone had sort of forgotten about. But as I was walking past it, I thought, do you know, that's never going to become waste. Like, I mean, it will eventually, right? But someone will find this, because it's a beautiful. I mean, the traffic cone is sort of a beautiful design, right? It has sort of universal meaning and interoperability. Another construction worker could pick it up, put it on the back of their truck, and say, "I'll use that," because it has a sort of value and significance, regardless of who owns it or where it shows up. And that's sort of what I want to see more of in 2050. I want to be seeing bits of reusable packaging that are sort of beat up and have a patina on them. People rocking their clothing that's got stitches and patches all over it because they've kept it in use for ages, or people celebrating these different new methods of making and using things, whether that's growing their own food, or buying food that's sort of regeneratively sourced or refillable packaging, things like that. I guess what I'm saying is I want circular economy solutions to, by 2050, predominantly be the norm. It would be a sort of weird alternative to be buying the sort of linear, single-use, destructive version. I want these sort of currently slightly sort of alternative, quirky solutions that are sometimes in our current model a bit harder to find. I want them to be the norm. I want them to be the dominant way of living your life, really.
Joe Iles of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, circular design expert and aficionado. That was excellent. I mean, I'm never going to look at traffic cone the same way. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Future of XYZ.
Thanks, Lisa. I enjoyed it.
Everyone watching and listening, you know where to find us. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review and check out the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's work at ellenmacarthur.org. Joe, thank you again, and we will see you all in 2 weeks' time.